Great. I think we have 20 minutes, about 20 minutes or two. So I open up the floor. If there are any questions, we'll follow the same pattern as before. So first individual questions, and then towards when time's starting to run out, we'll collect the questions. So any questions? No? Yes, there is a question. Bonnie?
I'll just get us started. Those were both really interesting talks. Thank you very much. My question is more for Kara, but it's in reading your talk in light of Eyal's talk. And I'm not sure if I understood you correctly, so just correct me if I'm wrong. But it sounded from your talk like that line from Shaviro that you were quoting, where he's talking about how processes of production are no longer tied to any concrete processes of production, that last thing. It sounded like you were agreeing with it, or at least not arguing with it in the context of your talk. And I wanted to ask you about that, because I think what we just saw Eyal doing was taking something that could be really abstract and kind of impossible to parse and sort of finding the concrete processes of production of clouds, for example, right? And I thought that where you were headed was something like that because of the way that you were focusing on blackness and liquidity as not as somehow tensely related to blackness in the Grace Jones video. So I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are about that. Do you agree with that statement by Shaviro in your, I keep mispronouncing his name, in your talk, or if you did agree with it, what would you say to a challenge that would say that what best serves maybe the kinds of work that you yourself are favoring in racial studies would be to find the processes of concrete production with reference to racial violence as well? Does that make sense? Okay. Thank you.
Please.
So I relied a lot on Shaviro's reading of our engagement with Concrete Cannibal because, I think that he did a pretty, he did two things. One was he kind of laid out a lot of what I think one would say about that video, right? And in doing that, he also provided a way of thinking that I think is what circulates. So I think that the version that he gives is a kind of masterful reading of it. That is one that I think most people would agree with. Most people who are looking at that type of thing would agree with that, right? So I think that what I understood him to be saying with that line was that the sort of basic relations, labor relations, are no longer the only thing that's driving the production of surplus, right? So of surplus value, so that basic labor relations are still there, and I think that he would say that, and I say that, but that at the level of financialization, part of what's happening is that there's this abstraction that is no longer only relying upon the extraction of labor power in those ways. So in that regard, part of what I was interested in then is saying, aren't there still then material ways that we can get at the material implications of this, even by looking at something like a music video, right? Doesn't the digital kind of open up a way for us still to talk about those material relations? Because some of the problems that someone like Shaviro identifies are problems that have been identified in other moments as well, looking at other media, looking at older media, but also thinking about other phases of capital. Does that respond?
Other questions? Nicola?
I have a question for Eyal.
Of course.
Basically, I mean, I was part of one of the cases of forensic architecture in Israel-Palestine, and we won a case against the Supreme Court. And we produced a certain kind of argument against the construction of the separation wall. So the argument was the wall is going to endanger nature and create a damage for the landscape. So the Supreme Court decided not to continue with the construction of the wall in a specific section of the West Bank. But then I do not understand to which kind of argument or counter-argument this kind of research about the Hannibal Doctrine, which is well known. So I don't know, I do not understand what is the counter-argument that you would produce at the International Criminal Court by increasing the sophistication of the production of evidence, because basically this is what the process leads to. And I do not understand, at the beginning you said, you know, we want to produce, we want to develop forensics against the state, and it's clear, forensics against the state, but it's not clear to me how this going against the state would change the rules in an international forum in which there is a specific asymmetry of power and a specific interpretation of international laws which do not have to do with the state. So, yeah, basically, what is the architecture of the argument that accompanies this increasing production of evidence in the case of the Hannibal Doctrine?
You know, the evidence is not produced by us, it's interpreted by us. We invest enormous amount of interpretive labor to look very carefully at what people sent us and what people produce, risking their lives to send us. So climbing on a building in the middle of war is a very dangerous thing. And when hundreds of people do it, it becomes not only a technical thing, it becomes a project, a common project, that operates between those people that receive, compose, interpret, working together with the people that produce it, etc. You know, there is many arguments for why to do and why not to do. I mean, I think that perhaps the most basic argument is to say this is history. No, I mean, to write a story of one day is the responsibility of a historian to know what happened. But forensics is more than history. No, it's a kind of one of the limit conditions of history, because you are mobilizing it in a very particular way, in a very particular forum. And then you need to ask yourself, at this time, and this is a question that we always do ask ourselves, no? We are kind of perhaps even overdoing, but certainly doing, a kind of an autocritical approach to say, are we going to the Israeli courts? And often not. I mean, in the Bitunia case, we refused to enter into the Israeli court, and we kind of sniped at the legal process from the outside. But I think that right now, the use of the ICC, the move to the ICC, the move from, to turn that into a kind of a civil society project in Palestine, with a popular demand, and an understanding it was signed by all groups, from Hamas to Islamic Jihad, PFLP, DFLP, Fatah. All of them adopted that as the strategy. I think that the ICC is not exactly one of those courts right now that would be, in which the existing balance of power between Israeli and Palestinian would be maintained. I do not know. Most likely, there would, nothing would happen from it. But it's a leverage of power. In fact, I think that the ICC is as good as the threat of an ICC, of an investigation undertaken, of the kind of the worry that it sends through, on a very simple level, Israelis, officers, thinking they could not travel or yes travel, etc. The question is also how other forms of civil society activism operates with it, right? It's not to replace popular protest or popular action in any other way, but to complement it. Sometimes you need that process to have happened in order to gather around it, in order to mobilize around a particular evidence. So I think both the idea that evidence production has become a project, a common project, and the necessity for other civil society initiatives like BDS, for example, to have a peg, no? to hang on, is important in this instant. But we chose the Hannibal in particular because it goes to the heart of the idea of negotiation, non-negotiation, and non-recognition. The idea of, so this is something that really interested us. No? I mean, we take our cases not only because this is a legal case that will be tactically useful, and I think this is a tactically useful case. I think that we try to from looking at the micro details of the event to understand the kind of the longer history of captured, of prisoners, of prisoner exchange in the economy of the conflict. The idea that having a soldier is an opening for negotiation. The idea that the state had continuously negotiated when they had a soldier. The idea of hunting one soldier down is an idea of closing down negotiation. The very possibility, even between a right-wing government and Hamas, right? I mean, that kind of impossible negotiation that has to happen when a soldier is there, I think is a very historically important point to investigate, not only to protest with, to provide evidence for, but to understand what is happening there in the economy of violence, when the economy is not only the necroeconomy of proportionality, but that part of the economy are the prisoners sitting inside the country, is the Israeli public, the parents, etc. No, I mean, there's an incredibly complicated economy to investigate.
So there is a question by Gertrude René and also the gentleman over here. And also...
Yes, at the moment it goes also to
many questions.
AI, but maybe it's also touching some of the questions in the former lecture. So I would a little bit like to question this notion of evidence. So I mean, it's interesting that on some level, I mean, what this project is doing is a kind of a digital montage from events that are already, I mean, on some level in the first generation of material present. So then is a question here, so you don't have the witnesses, so this would be the first degree of evidence. Those who lived in the houses could speak up when it happens that the house was destroyed. So this does not happen. So my question is basically, I mean, to which point here technology becomes a kind of a superposition from where you, I mean, are, I mean, taking, and even if it has this kind of switch in media that you finally would go to the court, so that it has a kind of legal evidence. So from which standpoint on would be, I mean, let's say the authorization of evidence be done? Would the court accept this as evidence, as proof, as it would maybe a kind of a first-degree witness?
We don't know.
For me a
question. We don't know yet. Every time
so, but
that
I
we
mean, let's say the
court,
project itself is so much obsessed on some level with these possibilities of the technology to be able to, I mean, reconstruct an event, what you have in all military observational tools. And so on some level it's taking up tool and
of course,
to bring it to another aim, so to say.
yes.
And so I wonder, was it when it's not going to court, so what functions does it have politically?
Yeah. You know, this is a longer discussion on the project, and we've written extensively about the difference between forensics and forensis being kind of looking at the art of the forum, kind of going back to the root of that. And this is and kind of thinking the very multiple forums in which same evidence could enter and how it performs absolutely different in each one of them. One thing that I can tell you is that when we work with lawyers or with any other groups, we never surrender our evidence to one forum alone. We're always saying that we're going to use it in another, and another, and another. And in each one, it does a different work. Now, if this is not first-degree evidence, I do not know. But I think that it exists in real time. It comes out of, as things happen, people are speaking into their iPhones and uploading that. The alternative to that is a year later, a human rights researcher or somebody goes there and talk to people. And I don't think it embodies less empathy, for example, than a kind of an interpersonal relation. I think every video records with the two ends of the camera. It records what it's aimed at, and it records the movement and the state, something little of the state of the person that has done the recording. And these are messages in a bottle that are sent.
Can we collect the
Yeah.
questions? So we
Yeah.
start with René.
But,
Yeah, thank you, both of you, for spectacular presentations. Actually, the first lecture of this conference by Rick Bellinger, Archive of Inconvenience, he said something that came back to me. He said, personal records will be more important than government archives in regard to search. And I was just wondering then to Eyal, how you just said that people send you things and also that they record things in this kind of role of citizen journalism. But did you also search on the internet?
yeah.
And then my question would be, second part, is it through, and would it be through image search as well? Because of the cloud function, and then the complicities of building an index to a corporate search engine and bringing these things into light as well, and the political implications.
I guess sort of on a similar note, you talk about how you're really looking at this issue of trying to kill the soldier as a way of undermining the Israeli narrative of seeking negotiation or vying for peace. So like, we're working for peace, it's the other side that's pulling back. How do you kind of take what you've looked at and not reinforce that paradigm of this one soldier's life is worth, hundreds of Palestinian prisoners? Say in the video you point out, this bomb here killed 60 people, was the largest strike of that particular day. How do you use your findings to also speak to those lives that were lost? Because I see kind of a problem with the focusing on the killing of the soldier, and then the other lives within Gaza get kind of sidelined.
Wendy, Lisa, and I forgot.
So first of all, thank you both for spectacular papers. And in many ways, you're brought together really nicely what Mercedes perhaps would call the flip side of the digital and evidence, right? And so you all were dealing in very different ways with opacity, evidence, and economies of violence and accounting. And so my question is really to get you to talk to each other precisely about this and the extent to which lying in wait and the sort of forensics might be related or not.
My question was about modulation, because it seems we have heard so many histories of software and people who have made them, and you were talking about history through software, right? The creation of histories through software. And when Kara talked about modulation and that which sits in wait, I mean, your demonstration of the modulation of crowdsourced citizen data through mapping, right, and through animation really made a story of how modulation can tell a political, not a kind of philosophical only or software only story about being. And I thought, Kara's piece about middle passage, like that is what lies in wait whenever we talk about race in the U.S., right? Like I'm glad that it came up and it was invoked, and so I was thinking, wanting to hear very much more about the idea of modulations of software and modulations of control, and how those can be narrativized in ways which kind of dislodge something or allow something to come into being, which may be in weight in the pixel, right, in the 17, however many you have. So.
There's one more question, yes.
Thank you both again for the talks. This sort of builds off of a couple of things that people have asked. So I'm wondering about, for both of you, strategies of making visible in relation to Edouard Glissant's right to opacity, which Kara raised and sensitively described, I think, as a sort of resistance to processes of commensuration by state power that would make Black or colonized people visible through a kind of measurement in some sort. So I wondered, Kara, if you could go into that a bit more specifically with how opacity functions in relation to a video like Corporate Cannibal. What does it make visible and how? And also for Eyal, how you see forensics as countering not only a state narrative, but a regime of visuality or a regime of visibility, if you see that even that kind of countering or an application of the right to opacity in some way, or if in another way you're thinking more about transparency and using technological tools to counter a narrative, but not so much a kind of function of visuality.
So we can proceed to lots of.
Okay, so I'll start and maybe we can talk a little too. And I guess I'd actually start with this question around the photographs and evidence, because even though it wasn't directly posed to me, right, the earlier ones, I think that there's also something that we're learning about the role that narratives surrounding any kind of thing that's captured, any event that's captured on film, the role that those narratives play in advance. So for example, for in my work and thinking, one of the places that I would think this through would be the Rodney King trials, which happened in 1992. And it was basically an event that was captured on film where the Los Angeles Police Department were beating a man on film, or on video, right? And there was this stamp in the, the date, the time, and that was the evidence that was used in court to make the case against the police officers, but the police officers were acquitted because the narrative was that Rodney King had to be subdued by this force because he kept getting up in the video. So literally the defense attorney used the video pointing to it and saying, look, he's getting up, And so it was this narrative that was already there in advance about the way that Black men are threatening to the police officers and need to be subdued. And I think we're seeing this similar sort of thing, although different. I mean, I know that like in my short presentation, I do these like kind of broad strokes in some ways, but there's a kind of similar but different type of thing happening with the police violence and the fact that like we watch on the nightly news someone being killed, by police. We like watch that, and that's, I mean, I'm not laughing like, haha, I'm laughing like there's a bit of like something that you can't kind of, you can't deal with it in a certain way. But that's evidence that people are collecting on their phones, right? And that's stuff that is circulating. And there is a movement that's, also around it. But I think that question then, for me, is connected to the question that you asked around the right to opacity, because for me, that's also a way of thinking about how to sort of deal with existing schemes of value that are, it has to do with value for me in some ways. and with how to think through what doesn't necessarily register, as valuable or as mattering or as, in these different, and we can go through different sort of iterations of this, but how to think a kind of relation that's not already working through those in advance, right? That there's an opacity there that is a right to opacity that doesn't have to become legible and transparent and all of these things according to existing schemas, but that itself can, exist. Right? Now, there were a couple of other questions, but I wonder if you're kind of thinking.
Oh, thank you, Cara. No, I don't know if I remember all of them, but let's say with opacity, I would say that any intervention in the visual field is about making a differential in vision. Some things need to be foreground, other need to be disappeared. There are choices that one continuously makes. There's so many things I don't show you. You just don't know it because I don't show you. But there are decisions about what not to show and where there is risk in showing, and sometimes you make errors, and there is it's an attempt, and I think perhaps you need to understand it in the context of not only of the forensic architecture work, but other works to do now with Israel-Palestine. How desperate, what desperation you can see through this work, that in fact there is an attempt to find desperately other forums by which we could say critique, ideological critique of the state, showing its, the bad thing they do and how they do it. We feel it's not enough. There is a desperate attempt to hang on to anything that we find. And these are the most compromising institutions, like to feel that myself and other people in the Israeli left would now, just like go and appeal on behalf of a law, of international law, it just shows you kind of how the kind of the closure of political options are existing. So this is not to say that the critical project is finished and we don't want to do it. It is to say it needs to do more than that, much more than that for us. And we need to find ways. We need to continuously look for ways, and looking for them is dangerous because you're entering into a field which is incredibly dangerous. And the danger mainly is a danger of becoming complicit, compromised by systems, supporting systems that you are against, etc., etc. You need to know how to navigate very carefully. You need to take all that kind of critical legal studies, critical visual studies attitude that you have in order to allow yourself to navigate, to measure. Are we getting, should we enter this or not that? Should we choose to show this and not that? How to do it? It's all entering into our own work, and I do not say that we do it correctly. We are, we're just starting up, and I can list you now a series of desperate mistakes that we have done, but we're trying to learn from them. And we're trying to operate critically within the visual field as a political practice. So that is something that, it requires a different kind of attention than...
Can I ask you quickly, is your data accessible, or because it applies to the issue of opacity, what you just said?
Yes.
Decisions that are made, what to show, what to use,
Yes.
perhaps, etc.
Yeah.
Are your archive, let's say?
Absolutely not. No, I would not. I do not claim to be neutral. Whenever we go to court, there's three things against us. One, you're not neutral. Mobilizing immediately everything I ever said about anyone, with a Israeli name. It's kind of coming at me both at Twitter, on the internet, and by defense lawyers. If in cases that we were doing in the Israeli court. Two, you're not an expert. You're artists and architects. What the hell are you doing here? This is for grown-ups. What are you doing in this? Artists were usually adding affect to the serious, quote-unquote, investigative work of human rights. For what we're saying, no, the visual field and the spatial field is a way to crack open a situation in a different way. So, rather than saying, no, we are serious, we actually did some engineering in university as architects. No, we're saying, no. When the problem is an image problem, image makers are the people that you need to listen to. It's a counter argument to say, you know, we're not experts. So no, artists are experts of sorts. So it's a shift. In that thing is the third one. Sorry, what did I say? This, that. I forgot the third one. There's always the third one. But the minute that something actually enters, and you know, we were thrown out of court, for example, when we did the white phosphorus analysis. No, we were thrown out of court as clowns, etc. Fine. But at other situation, it actually entered. The minute it enters, something happens. The minute it enters, other things could enter. So you don't just, it's not only part of a particular trial, it's part of opening up a certain field of possibilities.
I think we can thank again our speakers for a wonderful time.